Imagine what it's like to be on the edge of life when those who are supposed to protect you turn into your tormentors. The night, the smell of smoke, the fire engulfing the car, and you realize your life will never be the same. This isn't just a story about arson. It's a story of shattered fortunes, of how racist police officers first destroyed everything he had and then left him disabled. And afterward, they just apologize. But can an apology erase the pain? Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us about yourself in the comments. Write what your name is and where you're watching this video from. We appreciate each and every one of you. Your support is incredibly important to us and helps our channel grow and bring the truth to more people. Your participation is what makes us stronger. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy the show. It was an ordinary night. Marcus was driving home after a long day of work, feeling tired but satisfied that he had finally made it to the end of the day. There was silence all around, a deserted road, and a long-awaited vacation ahead. It was business as usual until the blue and red lights flashed in the rearview mirror. The patrol car was slowly approaching. Marcus's heart pounded harder, but he remained calm. He knew he hadn't violated anything. Seatbelt fastened, speed limit, no infraction. But as soon as the cops approached his window, the calm faded. Marcus rolled down his window, expecting the standard questions, but instead there was tension in the air. The two officers, white men with cold, contemptuous stares, didn't immediately start talking. One of them leaned against the car and slowly examined Marcus from head to toe, as if he were something dirty, unworthy of even their attention. The second officer finally broke the silence. "What are you doing here at this hour?" "Ha!" His voice was filled with suspicion and an underlying threat. "I'm just on my way home from work," Marcus replied calmly, but felt a cold knot of fear clench in his stomach. The officers exchanged glances, as if they had heard something funny, and the first, with a chuckle, said, "That's too good a car for someone like you. Probably bought it for something bad." That statement made Marcus's heart drop. He knew this was taking a bad turn. With every word the officer said, every cell in his body realized this wasn't just a random check. This was a hunt. These men weren't here to protect or help, they were here to humiliate, to show him he was nothing. Marcus remained quiet, but his silence only fueled the hatred in the officers' eyes. One of them pulled out a flashlight and, pointing it in Marcus' face, added, "What? You think you're too good to talk to us, nigger?" Suddenly, everything changed. Without explanation, without question, the officers ordered Marcus out of the car. They were no longer playing by the rules. The weight of the entire system that had suppressed people like him for centuries came down on Marcus's face. From that moment on, he knew he was trapped. As Marcus slowly stepped out of the car, the cold night air surrounded him, but much colder was the behavior of the policemen. They stood on either side of him, creating an atmosphere of total control, their eyes burning with contempt. One of them stepped forward and, smirking, uttered, "So, nigger, you thought you could ride around here in peace? Don't you know who's in charge here?" His voice was full of venom, which he slowly spat out at Marcus, as if testing how far to go. Marcus knew that any word could only make the situation worse. He looked down, trying not to meet the police officers' eyes, realizing that they were only looking for an excuse for another act of violence. One of the officers stepped closer and grabbed his arm sharply, twisting it behind his back. "Tell me where you got this car, or you stole it, didn't you?" The officer shoved him, causing Marcus to stagger and nearly fall. From the other side came the gruff laughter of a second policeman. "It's my car," Marcus replied calmly, though inside he was shrinking with fear. But these words only provoked a new wave of aggression. The policeman pushed him again, harder this time, so that Marcus fell to the ground. His palms burned the cold, rough asphalt surface. "Are you going to get smart too?" The officer leaned over and kicked his side, launching the first wave of pain. "Did you forget you're in the goddamn minority?" A hard shove in the back made him try to stand up again, but the second policeman quickly loomed over him, grabbing his shirt and ripping upwards so that the fabric ripped. "How dare you even drive a car like that on our streets? You think you're better than us?" Both officers were now taunting him, pushing him back to the ground each time, not even giving him a chance to get to his feet. Each new insult ripped through the air like a punch, breaking not only Marcus' body but also his soul. "Look at you, worthless. You'll always be down, always crawling like a worm." Their words cut into his mind, leaving deep scars. They laughed as Marcus lay on the ground, his face pressed against the pavement. He felt helpless, realizing that none of his thoughts or actions could change what was happening. All that rang around him was the silence of the deserted street and the sinister laughter of those who were supposed to be upholding the law. With each new insult, each push or blow, the realization grew in Marcus that these men would not stop. Their hatred was boundless, and they savored every second of it, making his life a living hell. He closed his eyes, trying, if only for a moment, to abstract himself from the brutality, but the darkness brought no relief. The officers continued to verbally and physically humiliate him, doing everything they could to break his spirit. Marcus was still lying on the cold ground when one of the officers spoke disdainfully. "Get up, thief!" A boot kick to his side made him hiss in pain. The officer added with a nasty grin, "We know people like you can't afford a car like that with honest labor." There was more than aggression in those words. It was an accusation fundamentally based on racist stereotypes. Marcus tried to explain, "It's my car. I earned it." But before he could finish, the other officer bent over him, grabbed him by the collar, and pulled him sharply toward him. His face was only a few centimeters away from Marcus, and at that moment he spat out, "You think anybody's gonna believe a black man who says he earned honestly for a ride like that? They put people like you in jail, not let you in expensive cars." Without giving Marcus a chance to defend himself, one of the police officers rummaged through his pockets and pulled out his car keys. "Now we're going to see what you're hiding in your car, motherfucker," he said with those words and headed for the car, leaving Marcus in the road under the supervision of the second officer. He grinned and started whistling a tune, as if it was his usual entertainment. While the policeman searched the car, the other continued to humiliate Marcus. "You'll never get beyond your ghetto. People like you always stay down. You know? You only live in this world because we let you." These words cut into Marcus, reminding him of the centuries-long struggle for equal rights his people had waged against such hatred. A few minutes later, the officer returned to them, finding nothing suspicious in the car, but instead of admitting the mistake, he raised his hand and pointed at the car, shouting, "You bloody thief! We know you're hiding something. We'll find something. Rest assured." He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his pocket and slipped them onto Marcus's wrists with a kind of malicious joy, snapping them with such force that the metal crashed into his skin. "You're under arrest for suspicion of hijacking," the officer said calmly, as if it were something routine. His tone was filled with absolute certainty that he was right. This wasn't unusual for them, they did it all the time. To them, Marcus was nothing more than just another black man who could be set up and broken down with no consequences. The cops started twisting his arms, with one of them snickering mockingly, "You should be grateful we didn't kill you on the spot. Nobody's going to be ceremonious with the likes of you." That phrase, thrown out like an everyday truth, made Marcus' heart sink. They were clearly toying with the idea that they could have done anything to him and no one would have stood up for him. The policeman put him on his feet and pushed him towards the patrol car. Marcus felt completely helpless, his body shaking with pain and humiliation. "So, are you going to be proud of your car now?" shouted one of them mockingly as he closed the door of the patrol car. There was absolute certainty in his words that this was not just a random check, it was a targeted attack, full of hatred and bias. Now Marcus was in a situation where, being completely innocent, he was turned into a criminal. There was no proof of his guilt, but for these police officers the facts were enough. He was black, and that was enough for the charges. Marcus sat in the back seat of the patrol car, his hands cuffed behind his back with handcuffs that were already digging into his skin, causing sharp pain. His head was buzzing with fear mixed with rage at what was happening, but he knew that any word or action could lead to worse. The cops, however, had no intention of leaving him alone. Before he got behind the wheel, one of the officers stopped at the car door, leaned over, and looked directly at Marcus. There was no sympathy in his gaze, only cold cruelty. "You think it's going to end that easily?" His voice was soaked with hatred. "We're not done with you yet, you bastard." The cop swung the door open with such force that it banged loudly against a neighboring car and pulled Marcus outside, roughly grabbing him by the neck and forcibly dragging him out of the car. Before Marcus realized what was happening, the first blow, hard and precise, came straight to his stomach. The air left his lungs instantly, and he bent in half, trying to regain his breath. But there was no time for that. The cop grabbed him by the hair and jerked his head up so that Marcus was face to face with his icy grin. "You're out of luck today," the officer whispered, savoring the moment before delivering another blow, this time to the face. The blow was so hard that Marcus felt his teeth smash into his lip. which bled instantly. His face was a hot wave of pain, and black spots flashed before his eyes. He tried to straighten up, but the police had him in an iron vise. The second officer, who had been standing on the sidelines, joined in the beating, starting to hit him in the ribs and back. Each new blow was harder than the previous one, and the taunts and insults were unceasing. "That's it, you son of a bitch. You think you can compete with us? Black trash," one of them shouted, leaning so close to Marcus that his saliva splattered in his face. Marcus could no longer resist. His body sank deeper into pain with each blow. The pain was so intense that he could barely stand on his feet. His ribs cracked from the blows, and his breathing became intermittent and painful. His head was spinning and the ground beneath his feet seemed to be going away. At one point, when his body seemed about to break completely, one of the officers grabbed him by the neck and threw him to the ground with a fierce shout. Marcus' head hit the cold asphalt, and the darkness before his eyes grew even thicker. He barely had time to realize what was happening when he felt someone's heavy foot press his face into the ground. "This is where you belong," the cop hissed, pushing harder so that Marcus's face was literally pressed into the dirt and dust of the road. Every second lasted like an eternity. His body wouldn't listen. Everything was racked with fiery pain, and he could barely breathe through the blood and dirt that filled his mouth and nose. "You're pathetic. You're a nobody," the officers continued to mock, as if that wasn't enough. Their cruelty seemed endless. Each new blow, each new kick or push was filled with hatred. For them, Marcus was not a person, he was a target, an object of their racial hatred, whom they could manipulate and humiliate without the slightest remorse. After one particularly hard blow to his back, Marcus felt a wave of pain surge through his entire body, stiffening his spine. He felt as if his bones were about to crack and he would never be able to move again. But the policemen didn't stop. They laughed, as if enjoying every moment of his agony. "That's for being born with the wrong skin color," one of them said, coming up close to Marcus and stepping on his arm. The pain was unbearable, but even that couldn't overshadow the words of racist hatred. Lying on the ground, bleeding in an unbearable pain, Marcus realized that this nightmare was not over. The policemen, taunting him, were clearly enjoying their power. One of them suddenly stepped aside, looked at Marcus's car, and his face lit up with a gloating smile. "You know what they do with stolen cars? They burn them," he said, turning to his partner. The words penetrated Marcus's mind like an icy knife. He tried to say something, but the pain from his shattered face, ribs, and arms robbed him of his strength. "Please," he barely whispered, but his voice was drowned out by the rough laughter of the policeman. One of the officers walked over to the patrol car and pulled out a can of gasoline. "Well, let's see how you like it when your precious car turns to ashes," he said with a mocking tone. Marcus couldn't believe his ears. This car wasn't just a means of transportation, it symbolized his years of labor, the hope for a better future, the things he'd worked hard for to rise from the ghetto they kept referring to with disdain. "You're sitting in the dirt, and this is your spot," the second officer said, leaning toward him and extending his hand as if he were addressing a dog. "And your car? Who needs it? People like you shouldn't be driving that kind of machinery. Your place is in poverty." An officer with a canister approached Marcus's car and began slowly pouring gasoline over the hood and roof, doing so with obvious pleasure. The pungent odor of fuel lingered in the air, and every movement of the policeman seemed to slow down, as in a nightmare where the victim cannot escape from the approaching disaster. Marcus tried to get up, but his body wouldn't listen anymore. The handcuffs, the pain in his ribs, the blood in his eyes, all of it paralyzed him. He lay on the cold ground, hearing his own ribs crunch with every awkward movement. "Don't," he whispered again, trying to stop the police officers at least with words, but his pleas only made them angry. "You goddamn beggar, you got nothing to lose," one of the officers shouted, pulling out a lighter. The flame flared in his hand, lighting up the smirk on his face. "Now watch your dreams burn." With those words, he tossed the lighter at the car, and in the next instant it burst into bright flames. A huge pillar of fire shot up into the air, illuminating the dark street. The flames greedily devoured the car, spreading with unimaginable speed. Marcus watched his only possession turn into a burning trap. The car's windows cracked from the heat, the paint bubbled and burned, and there was an unbearable smell of smoke and burning metal in the air. The policemen stood back a little, watching their case with satisfied faces. It was a triumph for them. Their racist and cruel intentions had been fully realized. They had destroyed not only Marcus's car, but also the symbol of his dignity, his hope for a better life. The car's flames were a symbol that he had no value in the eyes of these policemen. "Look at this," one of the cops shouted, walking up to Marcus and roughly flipping him over with his foot, forcing him to stare at the fire. This should happen to anyone who thinks they can be anything but dirt underfoot. Marcus, wounded and exhausted, looked at the blazing car and felt something inside him break. Not just physically, the pain in his body was unbearable, but mentally. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for and hoped for was burning in flames right in front of his eyes. The cops hadn't just destroyed his car, they had wiped out what was left of his confidence that he could fight for something better in this unjust system. The fire continued to devour everything in its path, turning the car into a pile of charred metal. Marcus, shivering with pain and cold, lay on the ground, realizing his helplessness in the face of unpunished cruelty. The policemen, laughing and insulting him, continued to watch the scene as if it were a commonplace occurrence. Their racial hatred had become an act of total annihilation. "Now you have nothing," one of them said, taking the last step toward Marcus and leaning into his face. "You're broken, and you'll always be broken, just like all you black people." Marcus lay motionless, realizing that his life had just been destroyed. His car, the symbol of all his efforts and aspirations, had burned to the ground. The fire was still blazing, reflecting in the eyes of the policemen, who seemed to be enjoying the scene. The smell of burning metal and fuel lingered in the air, and the silence of the night was broken only by the crackling of the burning car. But the worst was ahead. When they were sure that they had physically destroyed his property, they decided to break his soul finally. "So, you like the view, nigger?" smirked one of the policemen, stepping closer. His voice was soaked with venomous hatred, as if this bullying brought him pleasure. "This should happen to every one of you. You think you can live like humans? You are nothing." The second officer laughed and, with a grin on his face, began to slowly circle Marcus like a predator that had cornered its prey. He raised his baton and, without saying a word, struck Marcus on the legs with force. Pain shot through his body and he groaned reflexively, but there was no more strength to resist. Any attempt to move caused another wave of agony. The policeman struck again, this time on his back, leaving deep marks on his body. "See how easy it is to break you? One blow and you're helpless. Your people have always been like this," he said, coming even closer, leaning over Marcus's body. Hatred glittered in his eyes, fueled by centuries of racial prejudice and power. "We will always be on top. You are nothing and nobody. Your place is in the dirt." The policeman leaned over and roughly grabbed Marcus by the neck, forcing him to look straight into his eyes. "Remember one thing, people like you will never get anything in this world but pain." His face twisted with anger and he shoved Marcus back to the ground sharply, slamming his head into the hard asphalt. His vision went black, and the pain came in a new wave. But even through the fog in his head, Marcus could hear the laughter of the policemen, for whom this was all just entertainment. "This isn't just a lesson to you, it's a lesson to all of you," the second officer added, an icy certainty in his voice. He walked over to Marcus and, before he realized what was happening, grabbed him by the hair and forced him to raise his head. Marcus' face was covered in blood and dirt. His lips were swollen and his broken nose was bleeding. The cop pulled out his cell phone and pointed the camera right at his face. "Look at this loser," he said, filming everything that was going on. "This is what each of you should look like after you meet us." The first days in the hospital were a blur. He often fell into oblivion from strong painkillers, but when he came to his senses, his thoughts returned to that terrible night. The pain, the humiliation, the brutality, it was unbearable, and he realized that he had to fight not only for himself, but for all those who had been victims of police brutality. One day when Marcus woke up, a nurse came to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" she asked with a kind smile. He looked at her and, though he couldn't say much, he felt supported by her. She carefully adjusted his pillow and added, "You need to pull yourself together. You're not alone. We're here for you." He found a sliver of hope in her words. She reminded him that there were people who did not turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. But that wasn't enough. Marcus realized that he needed to tell his story to do something about the injustice he faced. He decided that he would fight for the truth. His friends and family came to visit him in the evenings, and each time he felt their love and support helping him to recover. They brought him books and newspapers that discussed racism and police brutality. He read stories of other people who had experienced something similar, and it gave him strength. One day he was visited by a journalist who had heard about his story. "Marcus, I want you to tell me everything," she said, and her eyes sparkled with genuine interest. "It's important. People need to know what happened." She turned on the recorder and listened intently to his every word as he, overcoming his fear, began to share his story. "They didn't just set my car on fire," he began, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "They tried to destroy me. It wasn't just violence. It was more than that. It was the hatred that permeates our system. I can't let that go unpunished." His words came out with difficulty, but each one gave him strength. When she left, Marcus felt relieved. He had managed to open his soul, to share his grief and resentment. He knew that his story was not only his own suffering, but also a cry for help for all those who suffer from racism and police brutality. In the days that followed, he continued to recover, but now his thoughts were focused on action. He decided that after he was discharged, he would work with human rights activists to raise questions about police brutality and racism. He wanted to be a voice for those who could not speak and fight for justice not only for himself, but for all those victimized by this system. He spent every day thinking about how his life had changed. He was no longer someone who just watched from the sidelines. He had become an active participant in the struggle. With every hour he spent in the hospital, his resolve only grew stronger. He knew it would not be an easy road, but now he was ready to go forward. When the day of his discharge came, he felt both excited and scared. As he stepped outside the hospital, he breathed in the fresh air, filling his lungs with a sense of freedom, but at the same time, he knew that the real struggle was just beginning. Marcus was willing to do whatever it took to get his story out, and in doing so, bring attention to the racial injustice that continued to plague his community. He knew he couldn't do it alone, but with the support of his loved ones and like-minded people, he hoped that his voice would be the beginning of change. Marcus walked out of the hospital, his body not yet recovered, but his spirit was determined. Around him stretched a world he thought was safe, but now he saw it distorted. Every street reminded him of what had happened, and in every glance he sensed a potential threat. But now he realized that this wasn't just his fight. It was a battle for justice that required the unification of all those who faced similar things. Marcus first met with human rights activists who had organized a meeting to discuss police brutality. He walked into a small office filled with energy and a desire to change the world. The people there were of all ages and races, but they all shared the same goal: to stop violence and discrimination. As he began to tell his story, the eyes of those gathered filled with sympathy. His words were punctuated with pain and anger, and he could feel his voice growing stronger with each passing moment. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else. We have to band together and stand up to this system," he stated, feeling hope flare up inside of him. People in the audience began to applaud, and it gave him confidence. Marcus felt like his story was part of something bigger, like he was part of a movement that was trying to make a difference. He realized that his one story was just a drop in the ocean, but every drop mattered. From that moment on, Marcus became an active participant in the organization. He attended rallies, participated in protests, and met with lawyers who could help him prepare a lawsuit against the police. Every time he took to the streets, he was overcome with a sense of strength and unity. He saw others sharing their stories, people supporting each other in their pain and struggles. Meeting with activists, they discussed creating a social media campaign to bring attention to their cause. They decided to use the platforms to highlight cases of racist police brutality and call for changes in the law. "We have to make our voices heard," Marcus insisted. "We can't let our stories go unnoticed." Slowly but surely, their efforts began to bear fruit. Hashtags related to his story and the stories of other victims of violence appeared on social media. They organized a protest calling for reform of police practices and accountability for those who abuse power. Marcus became the face of the movement, and it energized him. Every time he spoke in front of a crowd, he felt his confidence grow. But not everything was going smoothly. He faced opposition. Some people didn't want to hear his story. They thought he was just looking for popularity. One day, at an event, an aggressive opponent approached him. "You're just complaining about what happened to you. We're all going through hard times, but you don't need to stir it up," he said, looking at Marcus with disdain. Marcus felt shame and humiliation come in waves. The police officer's words were full of hatred, which they did not hide. They were not only destroying him physically, but also tearing him apart mentally, turning him into an object of their racist amusement. The camera in their hands was a symbol of power. They could record his humiliation, leave him powerless even in the face of potential justice. You think you can complain? Do you think anyone will believe the likes of you? One of the policemen asked with a wry laugh. You're just another black man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you know the best part? Everybody's going to believe us. We're the law. We're in charge here. The policeman stopped filming and stood over Marcus, lifting his foot. With a hard kick of his boot to his ribs, he forced him to roll over onto his back. Look at us, he commanded. Marcus opened his eyes. Through the pain he saw both officers looking down at him with disdain. Your people are trash. We will always control you. You were born for this, to be underfoot. The officers exchanged satisfied glances, as if this was just entertainment for them. Just then, one of them leaned over and whispered with a nasty smile, You are nothing. Always have been and always will be. This is your place, and you should thank us for not making things worse for you. But that worse could come at any moment, and Marcus knew it. His body was mangled, but it was their words that left the deepest wounds. The cops slowly walked away, leaving him on the road, alone with his pain and shattered dreams. His car was reduced to ashes, and with it all his hopes for justice. Marcus lay on the cold asphalt, every moment punctuated by unbearable pain. The fire that had destroyed his car had left behind only a bitter sense of loss and emptiness. He struggled to breathe, trying to get his thoughts in order, but the words of the policeman continued to echo in his head like an ominous whisper. Every breath caused a sharp pain in his ribs, as if bones had been broken, and Marcus didn't know how long it had been since he'd been beaten. Night had fallen, covering the streets with darkness, and in the silence only the echoes of distant sounds could be heard. The world seemed to go on with its life, oblivious to his suffering. He felt lost, as if he had been thrown out of reality. Everything he had ever known, everything he had fought for, seemed to have faded into oblivion, and suddenly he realized that all this time his life had depended on one single police force that was supposed to protect him. Instead, they had become his executioners. Knowing that if he didn't get help, he wouldn't survive, Marcus mustered all his willpower and tried to get up. His body struggled to obey, and every attempt to move only made the pain worse. He knew that if he didn't get up, he would remain lying there under the weight of humiliation and cruelty. Gathering the last of his strength, he began to crawl along the road, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Every meter seemed like an eternity. In the meantime, he could hear distant voices and laughter of police officers who were discussing how they had dealt with another black bastard. Their conversation was full of contempt, and they seemed to be enjoying this moment. Every word, every mocking remark hit his mind like physical blows. How dare you survive? Sounded in his head like a mantra. He imagined them laughing, remembering this night, how he, once full of hopes and dreams, had become nothing but an object of their amusement. When he finally made it to the side of the road, his world was even darker. No lights, no help. He crawled into some abandoned alley, hiding from the world. Marcus felt his body exhausted, and thoughts of the pain, the racism and violence he had endured filled his mind. One thought was the only one that continued to plague him. How was this possible in the 21st century? At that moment, a wave of despair swept over him, like a night sky devoid of stars. His future looked empty and hopeless. He thought of his family, of his friends, of how he had always strived to do something meaningful and now found himself at the bottom. Fear and depression squeezed his heart, but there was still a small flame of hope smoldering inside him. He couldn't allow himself to give up. Marcus closed his eyes, and images began to appear before him. His mother, who always taught him to fight, his friends, who inspired him to follow his dreams. These images were like the last ray of light in his darkness. He knew he couldn't afford to break. He had to survive. He had to fight not only for himself, but for all those who faced similar things. Gathering his last strength, he slowly began to crawl further, repeating to himself each time, I will survive. I won't let them break me. He was trying to overcome the fear, to overcome the humiliation of leaving it all behind, but deep down he knew that this trauma would stay with him forever. It was several hours before Marcus noticed a light coming toward him. His heart beat faster when he saw the silhouette of a car driving down the street. He tried to raise his hand, making a squeezed sound, hoping to attract attention. Hope and fear mingled in his chest when he saw the car stop and a man get out. The unknown man rushed toward him, his face contorted with alarm. Shit, what happened to you? He exclaimed, seeing the blood and bruises. Marcus could only quietly utter, the police. They killed me. This moment was his last hope for salvation. He knew his struggle was just beginning, and now he had a story to tell, a story that needed to be heard. But what lay ahead of him was not only a struggle to recover, but also a desire to confront those who were trying to destroy his spirit. Marcus lay in the hospital, his body wrapped in bandages and his ears buzzing with pain and medication. Memories of that terrible night still haunted him, like shadows that kept him awake. Every sound, every shadow in the ward reminded him of the policemen, of the laughter and taunts with which they had tried to break his spirit. But he was safe now, so he hoped. These words did not silence Marcus. On the contrary, they ignited an even greater fire in him. You don't realize that this isn't just my story. It's the story of millions of people who face this kind of thing every day, he replied, feeling anger come over him. I will not be silent until I get justice. He realized that his journey would be full of obstacles and pain, but now he was not alone. He had the support of like-minded people who were willing to fight alongside him. They began planning major events to bring media and public attention to their cause. Every rally, every protest was an opportunity for them to show that they were not going to give up. Each day Marcus became more active and his voice grew louder and louder. He began to realize that this struggle was not just his personal story. It was something that required his heart and soul to change society. And although it was hard for him, he knew that if he didn't fight for the truth, someone else would suffer just like him. As he stood in the square again, surrounded by people ready to support him, he realized this was not just his fight, it was the fight of all those who had ever felt unprotected, insulted and humiliated. We are not alone, he uttered, and the crowd responded to his words with applause and shouts of support. It was the beginning of a new era, and he was ready to be its symbol. Marcus felt his resolve growing every day. He began working to build a coalition with other activists, lawyers, and community members to join forces against police brutality. His voice was getting louder, and he knew that the time to act was now. One fine morning, on the eve of the largest protests, Marcus gathered a group of activists in a park to discuss strategy. They had to create plans for a peaceful demonstration, but they were also prepared for any surprises. We have to show that we're not afraid to make our voices heard, he pronounced, his words energizing everyone. This is not just our struggle. This is a struggle for the future. The meeting was held in an atmosphere of tension and expectation. People discussed their fears and hopes, shared their personal stories. Marcus listened to them and realized that every word, every experience was another reason to fight. These people became his family. They supported each other, and he knew that together they could achieve a lot. The next day, when the protest began, Marcus stood on the stage, surrounded by people who had come to support him. He looked out at the crowd filled with people of all races, ages, and nationalities. Their unity gave him strength. There was energy in the air, and he felt that now was the most important moment. We are here today to say enough is enough, he shouted, his voice resonating with the crowd. Enough violence, enough racism, enough humiliation. We will no longer be silent. The crowd roared, and that sound filled him with determination. As the protest grew, they were joined by other groups who supported their cause, but not everyone was happy about the event. The police, noticing the protest growing, began to pull forces to the demonstration site. Marcus felt the excitement and fear engulfing the people, but he knew they had to remain calm. At one point, as the peaceful demonstration reached its peak, the police decided to intervene. Marcus felt uneasy as he saw the police officers begin to line up. They were holding back the crowd and the mood changed to tense. They can't stop us, he whispered to himself, but his heart was pounding with fear. The police declared the protest illegal and demanded that they disperse. Marcus realized that these were not just threats. He stood up on stage, his voice even louder. We're not leaving. We are here to speak the truth. This is our land, and we have a right to be here. The crowd supported him with shouts, but the shouts of the police were also growing. Suddenly there was panic in the crowd. The police started pulling people out, using force, and that was the catalyst for the chaos. Marcus watched some of his friends face the violence and anger boiled up in his chest. This isn't right. It shouldn't be, he shouted, trying to stop the situation. The police began to disperse people, using batons and pepper spray. Marcus felt his heart sink with terror. He saw people falling to the ground as they passed out from the gas. This isn't going to be easy, pierced his mind, and he knew they had to fight back. He stood between the police and the crowd, shouting, "Stop! "We are peaceful protesters," but his words didn't seem to reach the hearts of the policemen. He saw them aiming their guns at him, and it was agonizing. Again and again he tried to bring the situation back to normal, but every time he opened his mouth he was interrupted by screams and noise. The tension had reached its limit. Suddenly, one of the policemen stepped forward and pushed him forcefully in the chest. Marcus fell to the ground, feeling his body ache again, and once again the images of that terrible night came back to his mind. But he couldn't give up. He stood up, and with each breath he felt the fear change to determination. Shouts erupted in the crowd. "Marcus, we're with you." That encouragement gave him strength, and he stood up again. He knew that even if he had to face the police, he was not alone. Gathering all his courage, he stepped up to the stage again. "We will not run away. We will not be afraid. This is our voice, and it must be heard," he shouted, and the word echoed in the hearts of the people. They were not going to leave. They were going to fight for their rights. That night was a turning point not only in his life, but in the life of the entire movement. Marcus realized that they still had a lot of struggle ahead of them, but now he knew they were together, and their voices would grow louder and louder. With every step, with every shout, they were getting closer to change, and he was ready to continue this fight to the end. The night that engulfed the city was full of chaos and sounds that pierced the silence. Marcus had barely recovered from the confrontation with the police, his body still shaking with fear and adrenaline. However, there was a flame burning in his heart that wouldn't let him give up. This was not just a fight for his life, it was a fight for justice, and he realized that the consequences could be serious. Marcus woke up the next day with a headache, but the sense of determination was stronger. His phone was already exploding with messages and calls. Friends and activists wanted to know about his condition and to discuss next steps. In that moment, he realized that their movement had gained momentum. "Everything we've been through shouldn't be in vain," he thought as he typed a text to reply to everyone. When he opened social media, his heart raced. Videos of the protest quickly spread across the internet. Some were filmed by his friends, others by random passers-by, and despite the chaos, many people supported their cause. People shared their own stories, and the comments were filled with voices full of pain and anger. But not everyone was on their side. Soon, waves of hatred and threats began to fall on Marcus and his allies. In the comments, it was possible to read how some users justified the police actions, calling them necessary measures to maintain order. "You were just inciting violence," they wrote. These words hurt Marcus and he felt anger coming over him, but he knew he couldn't afford to give up. After gathering with activists, they decided that they needed to continue the struggle and organize a press conference to draw attention to the events that had taken place at the protest. Marcus knew it would be risky, but he was willing to do whatever it took to get his story out to a wider audience. At the press conference, surrounded by his fellow wrestlers, he felt his heart beating in unison with their hopes. Journalists asked questions, and he tried to answer calmly despite the emotions bubbling up inside him. "We are here to say that we will not be silent," he began. "We have faced brutality, but we are not alone. We are not just victims. We are voices that demand justice." Marcus' words sounded sincere and seemed to touch the hearts of his listeners. His eyes glistened with passion as he spoke about the need for police reform and the importance of making every voice heard. "This is not just my story. It's the story of millions who face this kind of violence and discrimination every day," he said, raising his head with pride. After the press conference, Marcus felt that a change had taken place. People began to actively discuss his words, and soon his story was in the news, as well as on social media. He realized that public attention is a powerful tool they can use. But as the popularity of the movement grew, so did the threat. Before they knew it, the confrontation with the police escalated again. They began receiving threats, and Marcus realized that he was now a target. He knew that some of his allies were under threat, and that filled him with fear. Every day more and more activists received threatening phone calls, and this created tension in their ranks. Marcus was deciding how to protect his friends and realized they needed to be careful. One night, after a particularly heated discussion, he gathered the group together to discuss safety. "We have to be ready," he pronounced, looking into his friend's eyes. "This could get dangerous. We need to stay safe and proceed with caution." Their support gave him strength, but he realized that their lives would never be the same. Every step forward would be met with danger and risk. Soon activists began to receive security training, and Marcus himself began to learn how to better organize protests. He also began working with lawyers to prepare all the necessary documents to defend his rights. Despite all the obstacles, their movement continued to grow. New people came to support their cause, and each new voice gave them strength. They began organizing new events that attracted the attention of the local media. Marcus knew that they had to keep moving forward despite the fear, and that gave him confidence. But deep down, he realized that the real struggle was just beginning. As their cause began to gain popularity, he realized that the system would not just watch it be criticized. He could feel the uncertainty begin to creep into his heart, but he knew he couldn't give up. He had to keep going, to fight for justice despite all the obstacles. In the evening, as he sat alone, analyzing the events of the last time, he realized that his life, like the lives of so many others, had changed forever. He was no longer just a victim, but a symbol of the struggle, and that gave him strength. With each new day he continued his battle, and along the way he hoped that one day his story would become an example for all those who suffer injustice. As time passed, the world around Marcus continued to change. The protests that had once been street gatherings of his friends and associates were now attracting more and more people who refused to accept police brutality and racism. It wasn't just a protest, it was a wave that was taking over everything in its path, and Marcus became the face of it. He continued to work with activists, organizing rallies and workshops where people could share their stories and find support. Every week they gathered in the small office of the activist group, where they discussed current affairs, prepared new actions and looked for ways to raise public awareness. This week was no exception. At the meeting, full of energy and determination, Marcus talked about the importance of their movement and how they should expand their efforts. "We have to keep collecting stories," he pronounced, looking at his comrades. "Every story matters, and we must make sure they are heard. We can change the system if all of our voices are united." The crowd approved of his words. They knew what needed to be done. Soon new faces began to appear in the office, people from other neighborhoods eager to share their stories of racism and police brutality. Each new story only strengthened the resolve of Marcus and his team. The following week they organized a big rally to be held in the city center. Thousands of people were expected to attend. Marcus, standing on the stage, felt excitement sweep over him, but it was both excitement and joy. He knew that this was going to be an important moment in their fight. The day of the rally had arrived. The weather was wonderful, the sun was shining, and there was an atmosphere of hope and unity in the air. People came from all over the city, holding placards and chanting slogans. Marcus stood on the stage, looking at the many faces full of determination. He realized that this was the moment when their movement could reach a new level. As soon as the rally began, he could feel the tension in the air building. He began to talk about the importance of the struggle and how each of them had become a part of this movement. "We are here to demand change. We are here to say we will not tolerate violence," he shouted, and the crowd responded with loud shouts of support. But among the many determined, there were those who did not want to see change. As the protest continued, a number of aggressive people began to approach them. Some were locals and others were provocateurs who had come to spread fear and discord. Marcus noticed a few people starting to argue with the rally. It was quiet at first, but soon voices rose up. "You're just causing trouble," one of the men shouted, his face contorted with anger. "Why do you want to do this? We have to live in peace." Marcus realized that they could not afford to fall into provocation. He stepped forward and, looking into his opponent's eyes, uttered, "We're not making trouble. We are talking about justice. We are demanding to be heard, and this is not provocation, this is our life." The crowd supported his words, and it seemed that all the negative emotions began to dissipate, but the situation was still tense. The police were lining up again, creating a ring around the rally, and it wasn't adding to the calm. Marcus knew they had to act wisely or the protest could turn violent. Fortunately, the organizers of the rally had prepared in advance for possible provocations. They envisioned that in case the situation escalated, there would be observers on site to record everything that happened. This strategy helped them avoid violence, but tensions continued to rise. Despite everything that was happening, Marcus wasn't going to give up. He stood up on stage, gathering his courage. "We're here to create change. We're here to protect each other. Let's do it peacefully," he pronounced, and that calmed the crowd. He knew that their strength lay in unity, and that their every move had to be thoughtful. As the day drew to a close, the protesters began to disperse, but their determination remained. They knew that their fight was just beginning. Marcus, As he saw people off, felt his heart fill with hope. This was more than a movement, it was a community that was striving for change. The next day, Marcus saw the news coverage of the rally go viral. His words, his passion, his fight all began to gain traction. He realized that now the public was starting to pay attention, and this was just the beginning. However, along with this popularity came new problems. He felt the pressure mounting on him. Now he was not only speaking for himself, but had become a symbol of struggle for many. He knew that his actions now had to be careful and cautious. Each night he thought more and more about the fact that their movement could have not only positive changes, but also unintended consequences, and each day he realized that their struggle required not only courage, but also the ability to think strategically. Marcus knew that with each step forward they were getting closer to change, and while his heart was filled with hope, he also realized that the real challenges were just beginning. He and his team were ready to continue this battle despite the risks. Their voice was louder now, and they were determined to make changes that could make a difference in the world. With each new action, each rally, Marcus realized that their movement had become more than just a group of people demanding change. They had become a threat to an entrenched system that was not going to give up without a fight. That evening when he returned home after a successful rally, Marcus found that his door was open. His heart beat more frequently. He slowly entered the apartment, his senses heightened. As he looked around the room, anxiety grew. Nothing had been stolen, but he noticed that some things had been moved. It wasn't just petty stuff, someone was looking for something, and it suggested more serious intentions. He closed the doors and immediately dialed the number of his activist friend to discuss his concerns. "Eric, I think we're being followed," he said, trying to remain calm. "I had signs that someone was in my apartment. I don't know what to do." Eric, always supportive, offered to meet with the rest of the activists to discuss the situation. "We can't let fear take over," he pronounced. "We have to be careful, but we also have to stay united. Let's meet and we'll figure out how to proceed." That evening when they gathered in the office, the atmosphere was heavy. Everyone realized that now they were not just activists, they had become targets. Marcus looked into the eyes of his friends and felt them share his fear, but also his determination. "We have to develop a security strategy," he said, looking at everyone. "Each of us must know what to do in case we run into the police or if someone tries to intimidate us. Our strength is in unity, and we must be prepared for any eventuality." The activists began discussing precautionary measures. They created lists of phone numbers, found places to meet in case of a threat, and even thought of ways to protect themselves from aggression. But another feeling emerged from this meeting, a sense of determination and unity. They knew that their fight was not over, and they were not going to give up. The next day, as Marcus was leaving the house, he felt someone following him. He turned around and saw several men in the distance watching him. His heart beat faster. It could just be a coincidence. He tried to convince himself, but his instincts told him it wasn't. After gathering his courage, he went to the office. But once there, he found that the atmosphere among the activists had changed. This time the fear was palpable. Some were anxious, others were beginning to question whether the struggle was worth continuing. Marcus knew he had to boost morale again. "We can't let fear stop us," he shouted, trying to summon support. "We have to be strong. We're here to fight for the truth." But his words didn't sound as confident as he wanted them to. People looked over at him, and doubt was evident in some eyes. "What if we get arrested? What if we get harassed?" One of the activists asked, fear in his voice. It was a reflection of the thoughts that were troubling everyone. Marcus tried to answer, "Every time we go out on the streets, we take a risk. But it's worth it. We have to think not only about ourselves, but also about the future of those who will come after us." At that moment, a woman known for her human rights work approached them. "I've heard about your efforts," she said, her voice full of support. "I want to help you. There are ways to protect your group, create network security, and connect you with lawyers." Her words were a ray of hope. She explained how to use technology for safety, how to set up secure communication channels, and how to create a support system. This talk inspired the activists, and they began to form plans to create a safe space where everyone could feel safe. Despite all the problems, Marcus could feel the unity and strength of their movement only growing stronger. He realized that their struggle had only just begun, but now they were ready. Each of them was ready to defend their rights and the rights of others. They knew that there were difficulties ahead of them, but together they were stronger. After the meeting, they started working on creating a safe space where people could share their stories and experiences without fearing for their lives. This became an important step for them. Marcus felt that their movement was not just a fight for justice, it was a fight for life, for safety, for the future. Every day they continued to plan actions, raise awareness, and support each other. But deep down, Marcus knew that the system would not stand idle. He could feel the tension building, and his instincts told him that they would soon be facing something serious. He knew that every action, every meeting, every word would make a difference, and they must be prepared for any consequences. But in this moment, among his friends and like-minded people, he felt that they could handle any difficulty. And this sense of strength, unity and determination gave him hope for a better future. As the morning turned to evening, the tension in the air became almost palpable. Marcus knew that their movement had attracted the attention of supporters as well as opponents. Each new step forward was met with hatred and aggression that was impossible to ignore. They began to notice strangers watching their actions, and this added even more fear to the hearts of the activists. This time they were going to hold a protest against police brutality, and it was expected to be the biggest event they had ever organized. Everyone was determined but also anxious, realizing that each of them was risking their safety. The presence of the police felt like a shadow looming over them. Before the protest began, Marcus gathered a group of activists for one last meeting. "We have to be careful," he pronounced, looking into the eyes of his friends. "There are many people who want us to fail. We have to stay on guard." Some activists looked worried. "What if they decide to use force?" one of them asked. "We can't risk people's lives just to make our demands." Marcus realized that many people had such thoughts. "We have to remember why we're here," he said, trying to remain optimistic. "We are here to show that we will not tolerate racism and violence. We're here to demand change. But certainly we have to be prepared for the fact that not everyone will take it peacefully." When the protest began, the crowd gathered a huge number of people who came to support their cause. But among the supporters were opponents who had come only to wreak havoc. Marcus noticed a few aggressive men gathered nearby, talking among themselves. With every word spoken and every phrase chanted, the tension grew. The protesters chanted slogans calling for justice, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. But then, in an instant, the protest turned into something more terrible. Marcus saw one of the opponents move closer to the crowd, his face contorted with hatred. "You don't need to be here. Get out of here," he shouted, waving his arms. His shouting was the catalyst for the others, and soon they began hurling insults and threats. The crowd of protesters began to respond to provocations. "We have the right to be here. We demand justice," Marcus shouted, trying to calm people down. But the hatred in the air became too strong, and soon the excitement turned into a physical confrontation. Before they knew it, a group of opponents had broken through the crowd. At first it was just a verbal altercation, but soon there was a scuffle. Marcus felt his heart racing with fear and rage. He knew that this violence could not be allowed to escalate. "Retreat! Stay where you are," he shouted, trying to keep the crowd in a safe place. But his words were not heeded. The attack escalated and panic broke out among the protesters. People began to scatter, and screams echoed in the air. Marcus rushed forward to protect his friends, but saw one of his comrades being knocked to the ground. "Eric!" he shouted, aiming for him, but at that moment he was stopped by a stranger waving his fists. "You shouldn't be here," shouted the man, and Marcus felt a blow come to his face. Pain shot through him, but he couldn't let himself give up. He gritted his teeth and tried to get up, but another blow knocked him to the ground. Everything around him turned into chaos. The protesters were trying to save each other, and the hatred from their opponents continued to grow. Marcus saw his friends being attacked, and his heart clenched with horror. Soon the police, who were observing the situation, decided to intervene. But instead of separating the protesters and aggressors, they began to disperse the crowd with rubber bullets and gases. This only aggravated the situation. People who came for justice found themselves under fire from both sides. Amidst all the panic and fear, Marcus felt his consciousness begin to leave him. He looked at his friends, who were panicking to find safety, and realized that their movement was in real danger at this moment. Everything seemed unbearable when he finally gathered the last of his strength and shouted, "Stop! We are not enemies. We are here to fight for justice." His voice overlapped the sounds of screams and the whistling of bullets, and for a moment the people around him froze. This moment had become crucial. Marcus realized that this was the moment when they had to unite to confront the hatred that surrounded them, and even though his body was bruised, his spirit remained unbroken. This was their fight, and he was ready to fight for it to the end. Gathering the rest of his strength, he stood up, trying to stay on his feet. "We will not give up," he said to his comrades. Though confusion reigned around him, the flame of hope burned in his eyes. It was now or never. He realized that their unity was what could stop the hatred and violence. The confusion and panic that had engulfed the protests soon began to dissipate, leaving behind only fragments of hope. Marcus stood in the center of the chaos, his heart beating with such force that he thought it was about to burst out of his chest. Despite the pounding and fear, he realized that he needed to be strong now, not only for himself, but for the others as well. The crowd around him was gradually calming down, and he saw several of his friends, breathing heavily and with faces contorted with fear, trying to restore order. "To me! Everybody to me!" he shouted, pulling them to him, trying to bring them back to reality. "We need to pull together. We need to stay together." Marcus could feel the eyes on him, and it gave him strength. People began to cluster around him, some holding back tears, others trying to pull themselves together. "We can't afford to get discouraged," he said, voice full of determination. "We are not here to give up. We are here to fight for our rights." Some began to nod, and the flame of determination reappeared in the eyes of the others. But there were still many questions. What would they do next? How would they be able to continue fighting after such a clash? "We need to change our approach," said one activist, standing next to Marcus. "We need to make sure our voice is heard in public instances. We can't allow ourselves to be ignored." Marcus agreed. "Yes. We need to raise the issue of police brutality and violence against protesters. We need to make people aware of what happened here today. This is not just an action. This is a fight for our lives." They began planning a new approach. Instead of focusing solely on street actions, they decided to publicize their struggle through the media. The next day, Marcus and a few of his comrades went to local news outlets to report what had happened and get their story out. When they arrived at the newsroom, they were greeted with disbelief. "This isn't the first time you activists have wanted your story to be heard," the reporter said, glancing over at his colleagues. "What makes your story special?" Marcus wasn't about to back down. "We are not just activists. We are people fighting for our rights, for our lives. Today's events are not just an accident. This is a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. We want people to know what's really going on." His passion and determination began to change the atmosphere in the room. The reporters listened attentively, and gradually they began to ask questions, inquiring for details. Marcus talked about how the hatred and violence they had experienced was the result of years of problems with racism and police brutality. Eventually they were able to draw attention to their struggle. Soon their story was published and many people began to support them. They received calls from local organizations willing to offer help. This signaled that they were not alone. But their joy was short-lived. As soon as their story became known, the pressure began to mount. Marcus noticed that there were strangers in his neighborhood. Watching his movements, he felt threatened, and that threat loomed over him like a shadow. Together with the team, they decided to create a defense plan. Each of them had to be prepared for any surprises. They started using encryption to communicate, checked their surroundings, and tried to stay alert. No threat could stop them from fighting, and they were ready to act, even if it meant stepping outside their comfort zone. The following week, they organized a press conference to once again get their story out to the public. Marcus, standing in front of the camera, felt his heart pounding with excitement. "We are here to declare that we are not afraid," he said, addressing the journalists present. "We demand justice and transparency. What happened at the rally is just a drop in the sea of violence our community is facing. We call for action and change." Marcus' words resonated with many people, and his messages soon became part of a wider discussion about racism and police brutality. He received support from various groups and communities, which only strengthened his resolve to continue his struggle. But along with success came a new reality. Every night he woke up with anxious thoughts. He knew that those who did not want to see change would not back down. He and his team realized that they would face threats and hatred, but no matter what happened, they knew they couldn't let fear take over. Every day, they continued to fight, striving to support their community and inspire others. Despite the challenges, Marcus felt their voices growing louder and their actions becoming more meaningful, and even when darkness surrounded them, a flame of hope burned in their hearts that nothing could extinguish. With each passing day as Marcus and his team continued their fight for justice, tensions rose. Their actions drew the attention not only of supporters, but also of violent groups who were willing to do anything to intimidate and suppress the protesters. These shadows of the past began to surface and their reality became more threatening. One evening, after a busy day of activism, Marcus returned home and noticed that his phone was beeping actively. There was a lively discussion going on in the activist group. He opened the message and saw that someone had posted a picture of his apartment on social media with comments full of hate and threats. "Watching you. We know where you live," one of them read. The message shocked him. A sense of menace enveloped him like a cold breath. He sat down on the couch, his head spinning with fear and excitement. He realized that their fight for truth and justice had attracted the attention of the wrong people to face. That same evening, Marcus gathered his friends to discuss the situation. They gathered in his apartment, all with tense faces. "We can't ignore this," he began, looking at his comrades. "We have to take steps for our safety. Someone clearly doesn't want us to continue our fight." Erica, who was always the voice of reason, stepped forward. "We need to be careful. If they've started intimidating us, that means they're threatened by us. But we have to put our fears behind us and continue our work. We can't give them the opportunity to stop us." Each of them realized that their fight had attracted hatred, and this created additional pressure. But at the same time, a flame of determination burned in their eyes. "We must also strengthen our security. Maybe we should contact local organizations that are dedicated to protecting human rights," one activist suggested. They agreed to create a safer space to communicate and work. Each of them had to have a means of communication to stay in touch and organize support when needed. This decision gave them confidence that they could deal with the threats that surrounded them. But they could not foresee how quickly the situation would change. The next day, when they took to the streets to hold the action, they noticed that the atmosphere had become even more tense. Groups of opponents were already gathering on the street corner, ready for provocations. As Marcus and his team approached the protest site, his heart beat faster. He felt fear, but also determination. "Overwhelm him. Don't let them intimidate us," he whispered to his comrades. "We're here for our cause, and we can't afford to back down." The action began and they started chanting their slogans, demanding justice. But this time the opponents didn't just shout insults. They started throwing objects in the direction of the protesters. This led to growing tension, and soon it turned into an open clash. Marcus tried to keep his cool, but he saw one of the women in their group fall to the ground. That was a signal to him. "They're coming for us. Everyone to the center. Protect each other," he shouted, and his voice overrode the shouts of hatred coming from his opponents. The crowd of protesters rallied, and they began to defend each other. But when the police intervened again, the situation became even more complicated. Instead of separating the conflicting parties, they began to act against the protesters, using gas canisters and rubber bullets. "We demand the truth," shouted Marcus as he was thrown to the ground. In that instant, he felt the world around him fall silent. His chest tightened with fear, and he realized that this was no longer just a protest, it was a real battle for life. His thoughts went back to the moment when he first realized how much this world needed change. Around him, his friends rose and fell, fighting for their rights, but fear slowly began to give way to hope. A sense of strength was building inside him. He knew that their struggle was not in vain, and they would continue to fight despite all the threats and hatred. Finally, when the protests reached their climax, they were able to reach the hearts of many people. A huge number of supporters began to join them, and the crowd became even more powerful. This gave Marcus confidence that they could withstand even the most difficult situations. Although the passion to fight for justice filled his heart, he realized that this was only the beginning. The threat would not go away, but he and his team would continue to fight, even as the world around them was plunged into chaos. Each step forward would mean more than just a fight for rights, it would be a fight for their lives, for the future they wanted to see. but the real threats still remained. Each new day brought new trials and challenges, and each of them realized that in this struggle they could lose everything. But, as before, they were ready to fight to the end to secure a better future for themselves and their loved ones. After the protests escalated and their actions drew the attention of not only supporters but also malicious groups, Marcus felt threatened. He couldn't sleep at night, replaying the recent events in his head. Every rustle outside the window made his heart pound. He knew they had to be careful, but the pressure of time and circumstance kept him awake. The next day, the team reconvened to discuss their next steps. "We have to prepare for the worst," Marcus began, looking at his friends. "We have a lot of people supporting us, but also those who want to stop us at all costs. We need to put stricter security measures in place." Erica, always ready to cheer up the team, added, "We should not forget that we are not alone. There are many who support us and are willing to help. We can connect with other activists and groups to create a united front against violence and hate." Marcus agreed and offered to organize a meeting with other organizations working on racism and police brutality. He felt that by joining forces, they could create a powerful movement that would not only make them more visible, but also provide additional security. Despite these optimistic intentions, fear continued to haunt them. In the evening, they met with other activists at the community center. The atmosphere was tense, but at the same time shrouded in determination. Many of them shared their stories, recounting encounters with police and violent groups. This reinforced feelings of unity and cohesion. However, as the meeting drew to a close, their success was overshadowed by new threats. Some of the participants received threatening messages calling for violence if they did not stop their actions. There was a threat in the air that could not be ignored. Marcus realized that they had to be prepared for any surprises. "We will act in such a way that their intimidation cannot stop us. If they think they can intimidate us, they are sorely mistaken," he said, trying to convey confidence to the others. Nevertheless, fear began to permeate the group. Some activists began to express concern. "What if this leads to more clashes? We can't risk people's lives," one of them said. But Marcus knew he couldn't let fear take over. "We can't sit idly by while they humiliate and intimidate us. If we remain silent, it will only increase their power. We need to keep fighting," he insisted. The next day they planned a rally to be held in the city center. This time they called on people to come with placards and megaphones to express their anger and demand change. It was supposed to be a peaceful protest that would bring attention to their cause. However, as they began to gather, Marcus noticed that opponents began to cluster around them. When the protest began, the atmosphere became heated again. Marcus felt his heart pounding with tension. He chanted slogans with the others, trying to keep calm. "Justice, justice," he shouted, hoping that their voice would be heard. However, the hatred and aggression coming from the opponents soon got out of control. A group of aggressive people began shouting insults, and it soon escalated into a physical confrontation. "You have no right here," shouted one of the opponents, throwing a bottle in the direction of the protesters. Marcus tried to keep his cool, but at that moment, he saw one of his comrades being knocked down. "Hey, stop!" he shouted, eager to help, but at the same time he was grabbed by the shoulder and pushed to the ground. "Get out of here! We don't need you!" shouted the stranger, looming over him threateningly. Unable to withstand this aggression, Marcus gathered all his strength and got to his feet. "This is not a solution. We're here to fight for our rights," he shouted, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was harder than he thought. The opponents began to advance towards them, and soon there were shouts and sounds of fighting. Screams of hate and thuds echoed in his mind, and Marcus realized that they were on the verge. He realized that this was no longer just a protest, but a real war for their lives and their future, and that battle had begun now. At that moment, he felt a cold wave of fear envelope him, but at the same time, a flame of determination flared up inside him. He couldn't allow himself to give up. "Pull yourself together. We have to be together," he shouted, inspiring the others despite what was happening around them. Finally, as they began to act together, the crowd of protesters rallied. They began to protect each other, creating a human wall against the aggressors. Inside them, the flame of hope was lit again. "We are not alone. We are stronger together," they chanted. This battle was a symbol of their unity and strength, and although they felt fear, they knew they would fight for their truth until their last breath. In this moment, despite the violence and hatred, they found strength in unity and determination, and this gave them hope. Each blow, each provocation only strengthened their will. Despite the danger, they realized that their struggle for justice was more important than any threat, and even when darkness surrounded them, they were ready to confront it and protect each other. As Marcus and his team began to rally the protesters, they realized that their unity was their only weapon against the aggressors who were trying to suppress their voices. But the threat from the opponents continued to grow. Each new day brought new unrest, and they became more and more aggressive. Meanwhile, in the dark corners of the city, the hurricane of hatred was growing. There were rumors about preparing attacks on protesters, that some violent groups were going to organize punishments for those who opposed the system. This knowledge kept Marcus and his friends in suspense, and every evening they gathered together to discuss how to proceed. One night, as they were reconvening in a safe place, information came to them that an enemy group was gathering near their headquarters. "We can't sit back," Marcus uttered, feeling the adrenaline pounding in his temples. "We need to show them that we're not afraid." That evening, they decided to hold a peaceful protest to draw attention to their cause and show their determination. But when they took to the streets, the situation was heated to the max. The opponents were already waiting for them, and Marcus knew this could end badly. Gathering in the city center, the protesters raised placards and began chanting their slogans. "Justice for all. We demand change." Their voices sounded as one, but soon a hostile group approached them, shouting insults and threatening them. "Do you think you can just take our city away from us like this?" shouted one of them, raising his fist threateningly. Marcus looked at his friends and realized they were on edge. "Don't be provoked," he shouted, trying to calm the crowd, but the hatred was growing, and soon it erupted into an open clash. At first it was just a verbal argument, but then a physical fight broke out. Marcus saw one of his friends get knocked down, and it sent waves of rage through him. "Stop!" he shouted, scrambling through the crowd to help his comrade. But his voice was lost in the chaos, while the blows and shouts of those around them came upon them like a furious storm. The police soon intervened, but instead of breaking up the conflict, they began to use force against the protesters. Marcus felt fear fill his heart, but he couldn't allow himself to give up. "We're here for our rights. Don't let them intimidate you," he shouted, trying to inspire the others. The lights of flashbulbs and the lighting effects of police cars ripped the night sky, and the air was filled with the smell of gas and smoke. Marcus rushed to his comrades who were trying to hold back the crowd. They were under pressure, and every one of them knew that this wasn't just a protest, it was a real battle for survival. While the police were using force, Marcus saw one of the aggressors dash towards him with a baton-like object. In that moment, he realized that this was no longer just a protest. It had become a battle for their lives. A flame burned in his eyes, and he knew he could not back down. "Stop!" he shouted as a blow rang out. His comrade standing next to him was hit hard in the stomach and fell to the ground. Marcus rushed over to him, trying to help him, but at that moment he was grabbed by his shoulder. "Get out of here. We can't let them break us," pronounced Erica, pulling him back to safety. Their resistance was strong, but the threat was growing by the minute. The police started using rubber bullets and the protesters were surrounded. "Run!" someone shouted, and the crowd began to disperse, but Marcus couldn't leave his friends. Left with a few activists, he continued to fight, helping the wounded and trying to keep order. "Pull together. We must help each other," he shouted, feeling his heart sink with fear for the lives of his comrades. But chaos was everywhere, and hope seemed elusive. Finally, as the tension reached its limit, Marcus felt someone grab his arm and pull him to the side. It was Erica. "Run before it's too late," he shouted, and together with the others, they began to back away to avoid a collision. As they ran, Marcus felt fear fill his heart, but at the same time, he realized that he couldn't let hatred break their spirit. "This isn't over," he shouted to his comrades. "We will return and continue our fight." When they reached safety, he looked at his friends and saw the same determination in their eyes. "We have to pull together despite everything that's happened," he uttered, trying to reassure them. "This is only a temporary halt, and we can't give up." Nevertheless, the night's events had left a deep imprint on their souls. Marcus realized that this fight would not only be a test of their physical strength, but also a test of their spirit. Each of them would fight not only for their rights, but also to change the system that had long continued to oppress them. That night, as they gathered in a circle, he felt his resolve strengthened. He knew that their struggle was just beginning, and they must be prepared for any difficulties that might come their way. Together they would become more than just activists, they would become the voice of those who had been humiliated and intimidated, and their story must be told. After the events of the night had escalated tensions, the group of activists gathered their thoughts and efforts. Marcus, still feeling the weight of what had happened, realized that they needed to rethink their actions and find new ways to fight for justice. Their meeting took place in an atmosphere of fear, but also of determination. Erica sat in the corner of the room, trying to concentrate on what had happened. "We can't let fear break us," she uttered, raising her eyes to the others. "We need to use what happened to inspire others. We need people to know that we're not afraid." Marcus nodded, realizing that they had an opportunity to turn their suffering into a powerful message for others. "Let's create video projects to show what happened to us and how it affected us. People need to see and hear our story," he suggested. Erica agreed. "Yes, if we can get attention, it will help us get more people on our side. We have the opportunity to not only share our pain, but to inspire others to take action." The next day, the team began working on creating video projects. They recorded their stories, sharing their experiences and how it affected their lives. Each video became not just a means of self-expression, but a way to draw attention to their struggles. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to feel excitement and fear when it came to the future. He knew that their struggle would not be limited to just their group. "We need to reach out to other organizations and activists," he pronounced, believing that this would help create a broader movement. Through social media, they began to find like-minded people, and soon they were joined by other groups willing to support them in their fight for justice. Every day they received messages from people sharing their stories, and this inspired them to continue. Despite the support, the suffering and humiliation they endured did not leave them. Some of the activists began to show signs of fatigue and depression. "How can we continue when there is so much hatred around us?" one of the girls asked, holding back tears. Marcus walked over to her, trying to give her reassurance. "We are not alone. Every voice we raise is a step towards change. We're not just here for ourselves, but for everyone else who has faced the same pain. We have to keep fighting for them," he uttered, feeling the fire in his chest ignite. That night they decided to hold another protest, but this time with a special emphasis on peacefully expressing their position. Marcus knew they needed to show that they were not just victims, but fighters for their rights. "We will peacefully express our protest and draw attention to our situation," he said, feeling the determination flowing through each of them. When it was time for the action, they prepared posters and banners with messages about the hatred, racism and violence they faced. A crowd of people gathered in the square and they began chanting their slogans. "No to racism, yes to justice." This action, filled with passion and determination, attracted the attention of passers-by. But as things were going quietly, Marcus suddenly noticed a group of opponents trying to disrupt their protest again. He felt fear clutching his heart again, but this time he had confidence. "Don't give in to provocation. We are peaceful protesters," he shouted, addressing his team. The crowd of activists began to unite, demonstrating their unity. They raised their placards higher and continued to chant their slogans, ignoring the threatening shouts of their opponents. Each of them realized that this was their time to show strength and solidarity. As the protest reached its peak, someone in the crowd of activists said, "We are here to stand up for our truth. Our lives matter." This phrase, uttered with such passion, sparked a wave of approval among those gathered. People began to hug and support each other, and this gave them even more strength. By chanting their slogans, they not only resisted hate, but also recreated a community based on love and support. In that moment, Marcus realized that despite all the suffering, they could create positive change and inspire others. At the end of the day, the protest ended peacefully but left a deep mark in the hearts of all participants. It was not just an action, but a symbol of their determination and strength. Although their path was full of obstacles, they knew that together they could overcome any evil. Marcus stood among his friends, feeling the flame of hope ignite in his chest. They weren't just fighting against hate, they were creating a future full of opportunity and justice. And even if new challenges lay ahead, they were ready to fight for what they believed was right. The day came when activists, including Marcus and his team, organized their most ambitious protest yet, a march in the city's main square. This march was to attract the attention not only of local residents, but also of the media and human rights organizations. This was their time to make their voices heard and get their messages out to a wider audience. Marcus and his friends spent weeks planning the event. They formed a coalition with other human rights groups and were supported by local organizations and celebrities willing to stand up for equality and justice. Every step was thought out, every detail considered. On the day of the march, the city found itself under posters and banners protesting racism and police brutality. A crowd numbering in the thousands gathered in the square, ready for action. The sun was shining brightly, creating an atmosphere of hope and determination. A spirit of unity was in the air, and Marcus could feel the excitement engulfing him. He walked to the stage where the audience was waiting for him and looked at the faces of the people gathered in front of him. "Tonight we are here to show that we are not afraid," he shouted into the microphone, and the crowd responded with a roar of approval. "We are here to speak on behalf of those who cannot speak, on behalf of those who are suffering, on behalf of those who have lost hope." Marcus' words filled the space around him, and he continued, "We demand justice, we demand change, we demand that our voices be heard." Each slogan he uttered created a new wave of energy and inspiration. Among the crowd were families, youth, and seniors, all coming together to support an important cause. People shared stories and it created an atmosphere of closeness and understanding. They knew they were on the cusp of change, and it was a sense of power that was impossible to ignore. But just as the protest reached its peak, police cars pulled up to the square. Their presence caused a slight commotion in the crowd. Marcus knew that this could escalate into conflict, and immediately began urging people to act peacefully. "We are here to express ourselves, not for violence. We must be peaceful," he shouted. The police seemed ready for action. They began to line up, creating a boundary between the protesters and those who wanted to stop them. At this point, some of the opponents shouted, "Get off our land." These words triggered a wave of hatred and angry remarks from the crowd. But Marcus and his team didn't give up. "We're not leaving. This is our land, and we have a right to be here," he exclaimed, his voice sounding like a signal to others. The crowd cheered him on, beginning to chant, "No to racism, yes to justice." The situation heated up and other activists came on stage to support Marcus. They began to share their personal stories, emphasizing the importance of fighting for their rights. People listened, and this created an atmosphere of understanding and solidarity. Gradually, the pressure from the police began to ease. They realized that violence would not work here. Instead, they started to listen, and this was an important step towards dialogue. Marcus felt that something had changed in this protest. Instead of confrontation, there was a desire to understand. At that moment, a group of local journalists approached them. They began recording and filming what was happening, and Marcus realized that their struggle was finally getting the attention it deserved. He spoke in front of the cameras, stating, "We are here to fight for equality, for the rights of all people, regardless of color. Our struggle is a struggle for humanity." The crowd exploded again with applause and shouts of approval. The energy was contagious, and soon the march turned into a festival of unity. The music started up and people began to dance, laugh, and share their hopes and dreams with each other. It was true brotherhood, an expression of resistance to hatred and fear. Marcus watched what was happening and realized that their movement was beginning to take forms he had never dreamed of. He felt that every smile, every dance, every word spoken that day was part of their common desire for change. As long as the sun shone, the protest continued. People united, taking one step at a time towards their goal. They knew that this was not the end. Their struggle was just beginning, and there were still many challenges ahead. But in that moment, they felt the strength of their unity and knew that together they could change the world. As Marcus looked at the crowd, his heart filled with pride. They were not just activists. They had become a movement, and this movement, full of hope and determination, would continue to grow despite the odds. This fight was not just for them, but for a future in which everyone could live without fear, without hate, and with hope for a better tomorrow. Dear viewers, we are very important to know your opinion about this story. What do you think about how the events are unfolding? Have you experienced racism or bias in your life? Your thoughts and experiences are very important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and put a like. It really helps us to develop and create new interesting materials for you. We wish you a good day and hope to see your comments.